"No, thank you," said Nimitz. "I do not want to leave the Navy." The man continued to argue. "Money is no obstacle. Write your own ticket," he said. Nimitz thought that one over for a moment, but shook his head again. "No," he said, "I don't want to leave the Navy." And he did not. Nimitz then went to duty as chief engineer of the Maumee, where he certainly learned something about machinery, to keep his hands out of it. While demonstrating the engines one day, he became so immersed in what he was saying that he did not watch his hands, and the cotton glove of his left hand caught in a gear. Before he could escape, the third finger of his left hand was badly mangled, and later was partly amputated. There was no other unpleasantness, however. It was a time of intense satisfaction. He was doing his work well, and the Navy recognized his worth. At about this time, Nimitz was tabbed by his fellow officers as one lieutenant who was bound to make admiral if he did not shoot the Secretary of the Navy or commit some other heinous crime. He had adapted himself perfectly to the Navy life, understanding and appreciating its discipline, and throwing every effort into his career. Later, when he was a fleet commander, his personal physician was to say that Nimitz typified the mercurial character, and the doctor indicated that the easygoing quietness of the admiral was the result of years of total self-control by the man as he rose through the ranks. In 1916, that career was furthered by promotion to lieutenant commander. When war came in 1917, Nimitz went to duty as aide to Rear Admiral Samuel S. Robeson, commander of submarines in the Atlantic Fleet. In February 1918, he was promoted to commander, and 5 days later he was made Chief of Staff to Robeson. The end of World War I found Nimitz moving from job to job as the Navy tested his capabilities. He was now in the upper reaches, the gold braid category. He served as executive officer of the USS South Carolina, finally getting his battleship duty, but not until he had taken a tour of duty ashore in the office of the Chief of Naval Operations, where he was concerned with submarine design. In 1920, Nimitz had his first large ship command, the USS Chicago, in the Pacific. He also built the submarine base at Pearl Harbor as commander of Submarine Division 14, in addition to his other duty. The Navy, in these post-war years of cutback, put a great deal of responsibility on a few shoulders. In 1922, he gained an appointment to the Naval War College, a course almost necessary for an officer who wanted to be an admiral, at least in those days before World War II. At the War College, Nimitz learned fleet command. "I was asked once how we were able to fight the war in the Pacific," he said years later, "and I said that we fought it just as we had fought it all on paper in the Naval War College. I fought the whole War of the Pacific when I was there in 1923. At the commander level, officers did well to have a friend among the admirals, and Nimitz was fortunate enough to have Admiral Robeson as his friend and backer. Robeson asked for him again, and in 1923, Nimitz served him as aide and chief of staff, Admiral Robeson then being commander of the United States Battle Fleet, which was in the Pacific. Later, Robeson was made commander-in-chief of the United States Fleet, and Nimitz was still with him, as aide and chief of staff. Nimitz was ordered to duty in 1926 to organize a Naval Reserve Officers Training Corps at the University of California in Berkeley, and he was later immensely proud of the fact that 2 of his young men of that day made Rear Admiral. "My chief satisfaction," he said, "came in getting in touch with up-and-coming young men, working with young and extremely independent young men with untrammeled minds, and trying to introduce a little discipline into their thinking and actions." June 1929 saw Nimitz relieved from his teaching assignment and placed in charge of Submarine Division 20. At San Diego, Nimitz gained a reputation as a strong, quiet officer, but also one who was notable for his hilarious and pointed wardroom stories. His associates in the submarine and destroyer forces were inclined to believe then and later that he not only collected stories, but made them up himself to suit the occasion if necessary. 2 years after taking the submarine division, he was transferred to command the USS Rigel and the destroyers out of commission at the destroyer base in San Diego, and in October 1933 he took over the cruiser Augusta and cruised her to the Far East, where she became flagship of the Asiatic Fleet. Thereafter, his responsibilities grew. 1935, Assistant Chief in the Bureau of Navigation. 1938, Commander Cruiser Division II, Battle Force, September 1938, Commander, Battleship Division 1, Battle Force. 1939, Chief of the Bureau of Navigation, a staff job he considered subordinate only to that of Chief of Naval Operations. All this time, Nimitz was raising a family. His first child was a girl, Catherine Vance. Next came a son, Chester Jr., who entered the Naval Academy and graduated in the class of 1936. Third and fourth were daughters Anne Elizabeth and Mary Manson. On December 7, 1941, Nimitz counted himself a very happy man. He admired the Navy, he was totally happy in his job and at home, and his health was excellent. The future looked bright. Then, within a matter of hours, Nimitz's career was catapulted into a new crisis, not one of his own making this time, but one on which the safety of his nation might depend. Nimitz had been under consideration for command of the Pacific Fleet when Kimmel was chosen, but Nimitz had then a 4-year assignment as Chief of the Bureau of Navigation, and so Kimmel got the fleet job. But when Kimmel failed in the eyes of Knox and the public, Knox thought immediately of Nimitz, and the appointment was made on December 17th. Nimitz did not then know that Roosevelt and Knox were determined to shake up the entire Navy Department. He established his lines of communication with Admiral Stark, the Chief of Naval Operations, to whom he expected to report from Pearl Harbor. From then on, they would have to rely on the very frank, basic lines of communication that members of the naval establishment had been using since the beginnings of the nation. It was well known among the admirals that no man achieved flag rank without also making a record of excellence and brilliance in the Navy. There were differences among admirals, they were human, but the admirals had usually managed to present a united front against civilian outsiders, and except for some squabbles, usually over such new weapons as destroyers, submarines, and airplanes, the admirals got on remarkably well together. It was largely a matter of the limitations and definitions of the jobs to be done, and the disciplined willingness of all officers to accept the hands that fate dealt them in the matter of command. In the case of Kimmel, for example, the admirals realized that his brilliant career had been blasted because he had failed. In essence, it was as simple as that. At the admiral's level, there was no room for failure, and there was no justification for it. 3 days after his appointment, Nimitz was on his way. The endless meetings and the immense volume of work that had piled up since December 7th had taken their toll on Nimitz. He scarcely had time to sleep, and he seldom thought of food. Captain Shafroth and others insisted that Nimitz take Lieutenant Lamar with him on the journey across the country, and that he go by train to get a little rest. On December 19th, Nimitz packed a bag and stopped in at the Navy Department to see Admiral Stark and Secretary Knox for a few moments. Knox was very emotional and had difficulty in controlling his voice. After a few words, Nimitz was gone, he and Lamar heading for the railroad station to board the Capital Limited. Stark wanted to take Nimitz to the train, but refrained because he was too well known. They both knew that tongues would begin to wag if the Chief of Naval Operations was seen putting someone on a train headed west, even if that someone was a Mr. Freeman, travelling in civilian clothes. The new commander was extremely conscious of security and wanted to go unrecognized. Fortunately, in this regard, the Washington station was bustling in this Christmas season, and as the pair arrived, so did several trainloads of girls who had been let out of boarding schools and colleges. The two men made their way unnoticed to the first section of the Capital Limited and got on the train. There they had adjoining compartments with a door between, which made Nimitz a little more comfortable, for they were carrying secret papers, the first report of damage at Pearl Harbor, and various estimates and studies of the fleet and the situation, all in an old canvas sewing bag Nimitz had borrowed at the last moment from his wife. They locked one outer door and the door between the compartments, and Nimitz settled down to do his homework. Lamar was the perfect aide. He produced a bottle of scotch, and they each had 2 highballs, then went into the diner. Afterward, Nimitz went to bed and slept well for the first time since the Japanese attack. "I awoke at 7 a.m. really refreshed and feeling that I could cope with the situation," he said. At breakfast in the diner, they were unlucky. A man began staring at them, and when the man left the car, he stopped by their table and addressed Nimitz by name and rank. The man was a college professor who had been at Lincoln, Nebraska in October, when Nimitz had spoken before the Association of American Colleges and Universities. But Nimitz was gruff, not wanting to discuss anything with anyone, and the professor went away. As they passed through the lounge car on the way back to their compartments, though, they saw him again, and in their wake Nimitz could hear himself being identified as the Admiral. Lamar also told Nimitz that just behind them in the diner was a former Naval Reserve officer who had lost his commission and had been in the Navy Department just the day before, trying to regain it. Was there no end to the bad luck and the potential breaches of security? During the layover at Chicago, Nimitz got his hair cut, visited the Navy Pier and the Naval Reserve Midshipmen's School, and talked to old friends, including a fat old chief petty officer he recalled from the days at the destroyer base in San Diego, then back to Midtown to take the Santa Fe Chief, bound for San Francisco. The Admiral spent a couple of hours on his papers and then tried to teach Lamar to play cribbage, without much success. Nimitz had been preoccupied and silent for most of the journey. In fact, he was worried about his ability to cope with the new job. But as he napped and read on the long trip, his confidence rose. "As I get more sleep and rest," he wrote Mrs. Nimitz, "things are looking up, and I am sure that by the time I reach Pearl Harbor, I will be able to meet the requirements of the situation." But the more Nimitz plunged into the papers, the more dismal the future seemed. Next day, he confessed he found it hard to remain cheerful, but hoped that when he got over the first shock at the sight of Pearl Harbor, he would adjust. On December 21st, Nimitz learned that Admiral King was made Commander-in-Chief, and that King was replacing Stark in charge of Operations 2. He got this information from the newspapers. Nimitz's classmate, Royal Ingersoll, would become the new Commander-in-Chief of the Atlantic Fleet. Comparing, as he was bound to do, Nimitz wrote home that he expected there would be far more action in the Pacific than anywhere else. In San Francisco, Nimitz went to the house of Rear Admiral Ernest Gunther, commander of the air station, and Lieutenant Lamar turned around to return to Washington. The flight to Pearl Harbor was delayed until Christmas Eve. Nimitz hated to take away the pilots of the big flying boat assigned to him on this day of all days, but there was no choice. His orders were to get to Pearl Harbor immediately, and not even Christmas could interfere. Still worried and feeling insecure, he wrote to Mrs. Nimitz, "I only hope I can live up to the high expectations of you and the President and the Department. I will faithfully promise to do my best." And on this eve of departure he was very restless, upset because he could not have gotten to Pearl Harbor ahead of the Roberts Investigation Commission, which had formed in Washington as a result of the angry reaction of Congress to the surprise. President Roosevelt had been concerned about the congressional reaction, and in order to ward off what seemed to be an imminent threat of a full-dress congressional probe, he had appointed the Roberts Commission to look into the problem. The flight across the ocean was uneventful if cold, and at 7 o'clock on Christmas morning, Nimitz arrived at Pearl Harbor to be met by Admiral Pye and several other officers. He was installed in the new 4-bedroom house on Macalapa Hill that was reserved for the Commander-in-Chief. Rear Admiral Nimitz was now to become the full 4-star admiral in charge of the Pacific War. Admiral Kimmel had now been reduced to his permanent rank of Rear Admiral. Sometime in the last few days, Kimmel had quietly moved out of the house on Macalapa and gone to bunk with the Pyes across the street. On Christmas Eve, a few hours before Admiral Nimitz arrived at Pearl Harbor, Vice Admiral Pye and his staff made a new estimate of the situation the United States faced in the Pacific. It is sufficient to say here that Japan has twice as many battleships as we have available, even counting our reinforcement, 3 battleships from the East Coast, over twice as many carriers, counting our reinforcement of 1, Yorktown. In other types, the comparison is not so unfavorable if we include our Asiatic fleet and allies in the Western Pacific. The mission of the fleet was almost entirely defensive. while protecting the territory and sea communications of the associated powers east of 180 and raiding enemy communications and forces to reinforce and defend Oahu and outlying bases in order to retain and make secure a fleet base for further operations when the fleet is strong enough to take the strategic offensive. Defense, defense, defense. Pai proposed to strengthen the defenses of Oahu base, increase the army defenses of Oahu, increase local naval defenses by more anti-submarine patrols, surface air warning net, mine defense, and so forth, and increase the forces at outlying bases. He proposed to cover Oahu and outlying bases by operating task forces at sea and using submarines, but said, "Cover is a broad term, and its application in this case will be discussed later." As to covering the outlying bases, Samoa, for example, could be covered only occasionally, and the Aleutians practically never. Pai and his staff were very much concerned about protection of shipping between the West Coast and Hawaii, and, to a lesser extent, along the New Zealand-Australia line. As far as raids were concerned, Pai proposed to use the submarine force heavily. As to the surface and air forces, he was much more conservative. "We have forces available, carriers and cruisers, well suited for this work, and a judicious choice of objectives and timing will do much to make our defense effective and should help to improve our relative strength. We cannot afford to accept losses on a ship-for-ship basis, but will have to take some risks in order to strike the enemy a blow from time to time. The morale of the fleet and of the nation demands it, and it is only in this way that we can keep some of the energy diverted to the defensive, instead of permitting him to take offensive measures against us at will. Aside from raids on positions, we should make sweeps in force, not less than 2 carrier groups, in areas where inferior enemy forces and supply ships are likely to be. As our battleships become available, they can be advanced as supporting strong points on which the fast groups could retire. As Admiral Dremel put it, we were to fight a holding war, but there was little to do the holding with. They had written off the Philippines and the South Pacific. The crucial and critical time of the Pacific War would be when the Japanese attempted to take the North Pacific, and it was necessary to husband every ounce of strength to meet that challenge. If we should fail in that challenge, the whole Pacific and our west coast would be open to them. Nimitz knew that a holding war was not what was wanted, but this was not the time for him to step in. He planned to take a week to discover exactly what he had to work with. On the hill at Makalapa Drive he met Admiral Kimmel, and those who were there said Nimitz kept turning back to look at the ships sunk in the harbour. The shock had set in. Christmas dinner was spent with the Pais and with Kimmel. Nimitz, again preoccupied with the immense task before him, went to bed early, but did not sleep well that night. In his humility, he even wondered if it was proper for him to take over Kimmel's house, but was reluctant to take the alternative, to move to the submarine base and push some senior officers out of the bachelor officers' quarters there. In the morning, Nimitz began a schedule he was to follow for some time. He got up at 6:30, did setting up exercises, had breakfast alone at 7:15, and then went down the hill to the office. He launched at the bachelor officers' quarters and went to the office until 6 o'clock, then back to the house, where he was joined by the Pais and Kimmel, who dined with him each evening. After dinner, the group played 4-handed cribbage and talked. Nimitz then returned to the office for a short visit or went to bed. In the beginning, Nimitz did not sleep well at all. "To me it seems like I am on a treadmill, whirling around actively but not getting anywhere very fast," he said. But he was not discouraged, or at least he refused to admit that he was discouraged. Soon he had a letter from his son Chester Jr., congratulating him on the new job and urging him to be aggressive. He was touched because Pai and Wilson Brown showed so sincerely that they would do anything to help him, although they were much senior to him, and because he could see Kimmel straining to help too. The relationships among the 3 admirals, Nimitz, Pai and Kimmel, at this moment told a great deal about the Navy and the Navy way. All were vitally concerned with the Pacific Fleet Command. Nimitz was very distressed to arrive at Pearl Harbor and discover that the Wake Island relief expedition had been abandoned, but he did not voice a single word of criticism to Pai or about him, nor did he mention the matters to others. Kimmel, had the Wake relief gone through and the Japanese been met and defeated, might have saved his career, but Pai had destroyed Kimmel's last chance. Kimmel's resentment, if there was any, was so controlled by his self-discipline that he found it amenable to lie in the Pai's house and eat with Nimitz, while waiting for the President and the Navy Department to decide his future. Pai, patiently holding the negative responsibility of a caretaker command, made no attempt to push Nimitz into taking over, and expressed his willingness to serve under the younger man. And each evening these three men ate together and played cribbage. In the working hours, Nimitz was absorbing information as quickly as he could. It was essential that in the next few days he learn all about the Pacific Fleet, something he had no chance to do in Washington in the demanding job of Chief of the Bureau of Navigation. Each division of the command had prepared or was preparing summary memos, such as that of Captain W. A. Lee, Jr., on fleet readiness. It was important, of course, that Nimitz have all the weapons that his country could give him. It was equally important that he know precisely the degree of proficiency of the men who would use the weapons. As of December 1941, the picture was only fair. Lee reported that the general gunnery of the fleet was good. The 6-inch 10,000-ton cruisers had a very high degree of proficiency. The 8-inch cruisers were not quite as good. The carriers shot fairly well by day. The destroyers' gunnery and torpedo proficiency was very good, the submarines were very good, and the battleships had been good to very good. The fleet was very short of rapid-fire automatic machine guns, such as the Oerlikon and Bofors 20 mm and 40 mm. The attack at Pearl Harbor had indicated a distressing lack of ability to break up a torpedo plane attack because of this shortage, although the bigger anti-aircraft guns could operate effectively against horizontal bombing. As for the men who would fly the planes, here was a sad story that lent strength to the charges of fleet unreadiness, and more, American unreadiness. Experienced personnel had been withdrawn from the fleet in the expansion of the air arm of the Navy. The torpedo squadrons were particularly short of trained pilots, and this deficiency could not be rectified before the spring of 1942. There were no spare planes in reserve for the carriers in the Hawaiian area. Replacement groups were needed for all three carriers, and the only chance that seemed realistic at all was that they might get one air group of Marines if the Marines were allowed to fly from carriers. The carriers all had radar, but radar was still experimental, having been introduced only late in the 1930s. The planes had no identification friend or foe, IFF, equipment. The carrier men were fine flyers, and in a good state of training, but they were not proficient with their guns and bombs and torpedoes, because they had not been given enough practice. There was a shortage of .50 caliber ammunition, a shortage of bombs, and a shortage of torpedoes. Only 15% of the fleet, including the carriers, had radar warning equipment, and there were not enough patrol planes in the islands to carry out proper combat air patrol, tactical security measures, or to locate enemy attack units. Just now 20 mm guns were being installed, 16 to a battleship, 12 to a cruiser, 24 to a carrier, and 4 to a destroyer. Such deficiency could hardly be blamed on Admiral Kimmel or on Admiral Stark at the top of the ladder. No, the blame was on the level of policy. It was not that the Navy men did not know that these pieces of armament and equipment were needed. In the case of torpedoes, for example, no one really knew the effectiveness of the torpedoes, because they were never fired. They were only test-fired with dummy warheads so they could be used over and over again. The carrier pilots were not good gunners, because ammunition could not be wasted on practice. Radar was short because the budget did not have enough money in it for rapid production. After all, in these years just past, the Navy budget had usually been well under $500 million a year, and a $10,000 torpedo was not something to be wasted. Within the fleet, the Saratoga Task Force was out this Christmas week. The transport right left to reinforce Midway, and the Tangier returned to port, with its supplies for Wake intact. A group left to reinforce Johnston Island, and the decision on reinforcing Samoa was left to the commander of the Pacific Fleet, with Admiral Stark's strong hint that it ought to be done. On December 27th, Washington began asking some rather pointed questions about the abandonment of the Wake and Jalloy expeditions. That day, Task Force 14 entered Pearl Harbor for resupply, and that day also Admiral Pye decided to reduce the strength of the task forces and keep them in the Hawaiian area instead of out raiding. We cannot afford at this time to subject our forces to losses from shore-based air and superior carrier strength, particularly while 2,000 miles from base. Admiral Stark's urging finally forced Admiral Pye into a positive action. On December 28th, he sent the full reinforcement group to Samoa with the Yorktown to form Task Force 17 and escort the Marines and the supplies. Stark was again after Pye for stronger measures, calling for covering or diversionary operations against the enemy in connection with the Samoan reinforcement. This turbid state of affairs ended on December 30th, however, when Admiral King took command of the United States fleet. King's first official action was to send a new statement of the task of the Pacific Fleet. It is interesting to note that earlier the Naval High Command in Washington had suggested that Wake might be a liability. When it was abandoned, the same commander, apparently, asked a lot of questions about the abandonment. It was almost as if the command in Washington was in two different hands. The dispatch to Pearl Harbor, King's first official act, showed what Washington thought of the state of affairs, especially because it was addressed to Nimitz, although he had not yet assumed command. The new job was to cover and hold the Hawaii Midway Line and maintain communications with the West Coast, and to maintain communications between the West Coast and Australia by covering, securing and holding the Hawaii-Samoa line, which, King said, should be extended to include Fiji at the earliest possible moment. There was to be no more pussyfooting, no more pulling back carrier task forces to sail them around Hawaii. The sense of urgency in this message brooked no further delay by Nimitz in assuming command, and at 10 o'clock on the morning of December 31st, Admiral Nimitz put on the 4-star boards given him by the submariners of the Pearl Harbor base in honor of his establishment of that base so many years earlier, and went to Pye's office, where he relieved the admiral. Mrs. Pye was about to leave for the United States, breaking up the admiral's conclave, and when she left, Nimitz would take other officers in to live with him. In turn, one of Admiral Nimitz's first acts was to call the staff together. For weeks, the staff of the Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet, had lived in a sort of limbo, made bearable only by the furious activity demanded of every staff officer. The entire staff consisted of 32 officers and men, from Rear Admiral Dremel, whom Pye had brought in as Chief of Staff, to Boatswain Chester B. Clark, who served as signal officer. Other officers were attached to the staff, but these 32 men represented the central core of the Pacific Fleet on December 31st, 1941. Without visible exception, these officers expected to be replaced, following an old Navy custom. It was the practice for an admiral to choose his own staff, and the practice of the Bureau of Navigation to give flag officers the greatest leeway in choosing the juniors they wanted. For example, when Nimitz wanted to switch Captain McMorris from Kimmel's staff in the spring of 1941, Kimmel had objected. "I sincerely believe that McMorris is the one officer of the Navy best fitted for the preparation of war plans for the Pacific Fleet," Kimmel then wrote Nimitz, and he said he was most unwilling to lose him for any purpose. Nimitz, the Navy's personnel expert, had yielded, and Kimmel had his way. Most admirals had very definite preferences among the younger men of the Navy, and the junior officers were constantly looking for seniors whom they might serve, increasing their own chances of fleeting up or achieving promotion within one of the fleets. Nimitz, as noted, had attached himself to Admiral S.S. Robertson and had fleeted up with him. Thus, on the morning of December 31st, the members of the Kimmel-Pye staff were ready for any kind of bad news. But Nimitz had no intention of cutting the slender line of continuity. He was too new, and he had too many responsibilities to assemble and train a staff overnight. Quietly, in his most effective soft-spoken manner, Nimitz spoke to the men about the past few weeks. He said he had not wanted the job, that he had recommended Pye be retained permanently in it, but that he had been overruled. He did not know all of these men intimately, but he knew a number of them by reputation, for he had been handling their affairs in Washington since 1939, and he was certain that these men represented the high standard of the Navy, and that he wanted them to stay with him. He told them just that. The staff men were grateful and showed their gratitude, by putting forth even greater effort if that was possible. For weeks they had been under constant tension. Take Dremel. As Chief of Staff to Pai, he was responsible for presenting every situation for the commander's consideration. He worked hard all day, but that was not all. The submarines were the eyes of the fleet. They and the radio produced the information, such as it was, about the movements of the Japanese. The submarines came up out of the depths at night to sit on the surface, recharging their batteries for undersea running the next day and sending their messages. A nervous Dremel, then, found it necessary to work day and night so he could receive the submarine intelligence, consider it, and have it ready for the commander's desk the next morning. Dremel was not alone, although his responsibility was great. Lieutenant Commander Paul C. Crossley had been Kimmel's flag secretary. From the moment of the Japanese attack, the job had become a 7-day affair. Crossley moved from Honolulu into the base, so he could be available at all times, and he spent 12 hours or more a day at his desk, attacking the mountain of paper that was piled there. On taking command, Nimitz began a series of conferences with the senior officers at Pearl Harbor. Roughly speaking, these officers fell into two groups, those who believed in the overwhelming power of the battleship and those who had transferred their faith to the aircraft carrier. With the situation he faced, Nimitz certainly was not one of the former, although he had never learned to fly and did not like flying himself. Furthermore, although he never said this aloud during the war, Nimitz already saw that the slow American battleships were a liability rather than an asset. December 1941 was not the time to say so, but Nimitz felt it was God's divine will that Kimmel did not have his fleet at sea to intercept the Japanese carrier task force. Years later, when the Pearl Harbor debate was history, Nimitz explained that the Japanese had a fleet speed at least 2 knots superior to that of the American fleet with its battleships, and so Kimmel could never have forced an action unless the Japanese wanted it. Even if all 3 American carriers had been in the area and ready for a battle, the Japanese carriers would have outnumbered them 2-1, and with the Saratoga on the west coast and the Lexington probably unable to join up, this left Halsey and the Enterprise to provide air cover. Under those circumstances, Nimitz said, the United States might have lost all the ships and the trained men of the battle force rather than the 3,800 who were lost at Pearl Harbor. Nimitz's problem as 1942 began was to send fighting admirals to sea to carry the war against the Japanese. The war presented an entirely new problem for the Navy, one that must be solved immediately, the problem of discovering and employing the fighting leaders who would be most effective. In the years just before the war, a number of admirals were working their way to the top. In October 1939, as the new chief of the Bureau of Navigation, Nimitz had been in correspondence with Admiral C.C. Bloch, then Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, on the subject of flag officers' assignments. He had spoken very highly of Pai, then Commander of Battleships. He has an unusual quality for tactical matters. He is an indefatigable worker, and I believe as Commander Battleships will contribute most materially to battleship tactics and doctrines, and there is a lot to be done in that line. In the same letter, Bloch recommended promotions for Dremel, Robert A. Among the younger admirals, he mentioned Robert L. Gormley, Herbert F. Leary, William L. Calhoun, Lee Noyes, and Nimitz as flag officers, who ought to be in subordinate positions in the fleet to prepare them for command after 1942 and 1943, when the older admirals were expected to retire. That same year, Admiral J.O. Richardson, then commander of the battle force but already selected to succeed Bloch, recommended Pai as commander of battleships and Dremel as commander of Destroyer Flotilla 1. He had called Kimmel one of the best and Dremel superior. The next year, Richardson discussed officers' billets again with Nimitz, noting that he believed the best candidates for commander-in-chief in the future were Kimmel, Gormley, Dremel, and Nimitz himself, in order of rank. Now, in December 1941, Most of these officers were in and around Pearl Harbor, and it was Nimitz's job to sort them out and put them to the best use he could. Pye and Dremel were excellent strategists and tacticians, but their training and thinking were geared to a fleet whose most important weapon was the battleship. The others around Nimitz had varying views, partially based on their training and specialties. The meetings began, and they were frank meetings in which much salty talk was aired. One of the admirable attributes of the professional Navy officer is that he learns in academy days that he must live and work with men of differing disposition and opinion, and the successful officers are just. They engage in arguments of such intensity that one might believe the opponents were bitter enemies, until one discovers that their wives all belong to the same bridge club, and they play golf together, drink together, and go to the same parties. What Nimitz wanted was action and some ideas. On December 31st, Admiral Fletcher was at San Diego, preparing to take Task Force 17 with the Yorktown to Pago Pago, Samoa. He had the carrier, 2 cruisers, 4 destroyers, 3 transports carrying about 5,000 troops, 2 cargo ships, and the oiler Kaskaskia. His orders called for him to take the train in, then return to Pearl Harbor unless otherwise directed. In other words, Admiral Pye had conceived of the Samoan relief as simply a defensive operation, and had no plans for use of the task force once it came into waters adjacent to the enemy. The residue of the Wake fiasco, Task Force 11, was expected back on January 3rd. Task Force 8, with Halsey, would leave Pearl on January 3rd to relieve Task Force 11, guarding the Oahu-Palmyra-Johnston Triangle. The only offensive action underway was that of the submarines. 3 submarines were working Japanese waters, 2 were lurking around the Marshalls, scouting, 1 was at Wake, and 1 was at Midway, while one other, the Thresher, had just departed for the Western Marshalls to carry the war. Over the objections of his conservative advisers, Nimitz decided to send the carrier task forces to strike the Japanese. His most enthusiastic supporter among the senior officers was Vice Admiral Halsey, who promptly volunteered to take Enterprise out and raid the Japanese where it would hurt, in their Marshall Islands base in the Central Pacific. On December 31st, Nimitz ordered Rear Admiral Leary to take Task Force 14, with Saratoga as its nucleus, on an offensive patrol in the Midway area to seek out any Japanese units, sink them, and return to Pearl Harbor on January 13th. Leary had been commander of cruisers of the battle force since February. Here was his chance to distinguish himself. Leary sailed. On January 3rd, Halsey went out in Task Force 8 for practice firing, to improve the weapons performance of his little armada before taking on the enemy. He would go off for gunnery practice south of Oahu and then move north to practice anti-aircraft firing. He was accompanied by a 55-year-old rear admiral whom few in the fleet knew very well, Raymond A. Spruance, commander of Cruiser Division 5, with his flag in the USS Northampton. At the same time, the first change that represented Nimitz's influence was seen. Rear Admiral Bidwell, the commander of Cruiser Division 3, was not well. He was sent to the Naval Hospital at San Diego, and in came Rear Admiral Shafroth, Nimitz's assistant from the Bureau of Navigation, who had gotten his flag and now joined the fleet. Nimitz demanded readiness dates for the battleships that were under repair, and learned that he would soon have 6 of them. By January 9th, the tempo at Pearl Harbor had picked up remarkably. What was needed was leadership, and Nimitz was supplying it. They talked of the task forces, as if the words meant something. Task Force 1 was the battleships, under Rear Admiral Anderson in Maryland. Task Force 7 was the submarines, which had started right out doing their aggressive job under Rear Admiral Robert H. English and were going strong. Task Force 8 was Halsey, ready to head for the Marshalls. Task Force 9 was the patrol planes, given the mission of searching for the enemy. Task Force 11 was Brown in Lexington. Task Force 14 was Leary, out searching for the enemy. Task Forces 12 and 15 were convoy forces, using the available cruisers and destroyers. And Task Force 17 was Fletcher, moving towards Samoa. Convoy action was increasing constantly. The army was moving too, and 30,000 to 50,000 troops were expected to be moved to Hawaii by March. Leary was steaming home from Midway on the night of January 11th, his mission having borne little fruit, when suddenly the Saratoga took a torpedo on the port quarter. 3 boiler rooms were flooded, but there was no water above the 3rd deck, and she could be brought in. Still, it was scratch 1 carrier for the next few weeks. That left 3. Leary had been given his chance, and it had not worked out very well. Before the month was out, he was reassigned, given the Chicago and 2 destroyers, and sent to the South Pacific to command a combined force of American, Australian, New Zealand vessels. It could not be called a demotion. The job was a very important one, a transfer to an activity in which Leary was expected to shine more brightly than he had in carrier task force operation. The fate of the Saratoga, so early in the war, seemed to indicate the verisimilitude of the arguments of the battleship proponents, that the carrier was a launching platform that needed utmost protection. But what Nimitz wanted and asked for on January 15th was 2 more destroyer squadrons. There was no hesitation. 11 days after Saratoga was hit, Nimitz ordered Frank Jack Fletcher to take Task Force 17 and operate under Halsey in the Pacific as soon as he had disembarked his troops at Samoa. The fleet had a lot to learn about fighting the war, and it was time to begin. One of the early actions of the new task forces occurred on January 10th. It was so unimportant and indecisive that it remained unreported except through official channels. It involved an unsuccessful attack by carrier planes on a Japanese submarine. At 10:45 on January 10th, the pilot of the scouting plane 2F-11 zoomed over the deck of the Lexington at sea and dropped a message. He had sighted an enemy submarine on the surface about 80 miles from the carrier. The submarine had submerged when he flew over, but the pilot had the course and speed. He confirmed the facts when he landed aboard the carrier a few minutes later. Captain Frederick C. Sherman of the Lexington sent off 4 torpedo planes, each armed with 2 325-pound depth charges, the charges set to explode at 50 feet. At 13:20, 2 of the planes sighted the submarine at the approximate position given and began a down-sun approach at 2,000 feet, carrying out a bombsight-controlled run of 3,000 yards at 100 knots, coming in abaft the beam of the submarine. The pilot of 2T-10 dropped too soon, and his charges exploded 125 feet astern and 100 feet astern. On the first pass, 2T-14's charges would not release, and he did not drop. He came back at 1,400 feet and dropped, just ahead of the sub. But the submarine had submerged by this time, as 2 F-17 and 2 F-10 came barreling in, .50 caliber machine guns blazing after the first depth charging. The second set of depth charges was seen to explode, and one observer said he was sure the bow of the sub jerked to the right just then, and a small oil slick came up. All 6 of the search planes, the bombers and the regular fighter patrol, remained in the area for an hour, and then returned to the carrier as their fuel became low. Other planes replaced them, and the area was patrolled until 21:30, but there was no further contact. Captain Sherman said it was doubtful if the submarine was severely damaged, and it could be called nothing more than a possible sinking. Admiral Wilson Brown said he was pleased, particularly because sailors had been reporting whales as submarines so often that no destroyer had been sent out on this contact, and it was not until the depth-charging reports reached the task force that destroyers were sent. Nimitz was pleased, not so much about the submarine, but because the pilot of 2T-14 had used his head and led the sub by 50 to 75 feet, something he had not been taught to do in school. The men were learning, but there was a good deal to be learned. For example, all that difficulty about fueling the Lexington just after the Pearl Harbor attack could be laid to inexperience in fueling at sea. The inexperience was due to lack of opportunity, a serious shortage of fleet tankers. A division of tankers had reported for duty at San Diego in the summer of 1941, but was almost immediately ordered to the Atlantic for the occupation of Iceland. The task forces were still not properly trained in fueling, and there were many other problems, some apparent and some not. The aircraft still did not have IFF equipment. Many of them were not equipped with self-sealing gas tanks, a matter of very little importance in peacetime, But in the European War, it had proved to be a question of life or death to a carrier pilot when he went into combat. Aircraft production was not up to the schedule that the Bureau of Aeronautics wanted, and cannon, which had proved very effective in Europe, were just beginning to be installed in the Navy planes. Within a few days after taking command, Nimitz had the Pacific Fleet moving. He was very quiet about it, and he was not nearly so confident as he seemed to his staff, but the struggle was beginning, and even now Nimitz found time, as Rear Admiral Husband E. Kimmel was detached to go back to the United States for a generous gesture. He had Kimmel's orders written in a way that would permit the Admiral to take his family home at government expense. Kimmel had been asking Nimitz to secure a job of some kind for him, and Nimitz had tried, but Secretary Knox had refused to give Kimmel any assignment until action was taken on the report of the Roberts Commission. Naturally, none of us here know all the facts connected with the Pearl Harbor incident, and I am doubtful personally whether all the facts ever will be known, Nimitz wrote. Needless to say, I feel deeply for you. Nimitz's real attention at this point was focused on the South Pacific, where the Japanese were massing for something. No one among the Allies knew quite what. The Australians thought the strike would be at the Fiji Islands. Just as Fletcher moved in toward the Samoan archipelago, the Japanese too were on the move. From Washington, King began to put on the pressure. On January 20th, he asked for a speed-up of the offensive operations of Task Forces 8 and 17, and a raid on Wake as well as the Marshalls. After talking it over with the staff, Nimitz decided to divert Task Force 11 to the Wake job, and sent the tanker Natchez to join and fuel the force. Then, at 3 o'clock on the morning of January 23rd, the Natchez was torpedoed on her way to the rendezvous, throwing a monkey wrench into the plans once again. No other tanker was available except Neosho, which was not yet in harbour, and Nimitz had to order Task Force 11 home. Logistics were giving him a bad start. That day, the Japanese landed at Rabaul and began moving along the coast of New Britain and New Ireland, and heading for the Northern Solomons. Halsey, meanwhile, was preparing to deliver the first major American attack of the war. He planned to strike Jaluit, Mili, and Markin on January 31st. But again, the fuel problem haunted the American Navy. Halsey reported on January 30th that unless he could have a tanker, he would have to confine his strike to one day in order to get home safely. Nimitz then decided to dispatch Task Force 11 with the Neosho to meet and fuel Halsey. The oiler Kaskaskia, tanks empty, heading back to San Diego, was diverted to Pearl because Nimitz was very worried about the fueling problem. Halsey went in to conduct the first offensive operation of the United States in the war. Following the latest intelligence, which showed the concentrations of Japanese ships and planes, Halsey hit Votja, Maloelap, and Kwajalein, while Fletcher went after Markin, Mili, and Jaluit. Spruance took 2 cruisers and a destroyer to bombard Votja, and 1 cruiser and a pair of destroyers worked over Maloelap. For 2 hours, Halsey manoeuvred the Enterprise in a small rectangle just off Votja, fighting off attacks by bombers. Then he decided to get out, and the phrase "haul ass with Halsey" was coined. There were plane losses from anti-aircraft fire and Japanese fighters, and the cruiser Chester took a bomb through her main deck, but the attack was a success. Several Japanese ships were sunk or damaged, including a light cruiser, and, although the Americans did not then know it, a Japanese admiral was killed. If the raid did nothing else, it vastly assisted the prestige of the Navy and gave Americans the first chance to be a little proud. Fletcher was not so lucky. As Nimitz noted, heavy rain had interfered with the attack on Jaluit. Still, Nimitz remarked that the whole action is considered to have been well conceived and planned and brilliantly executed. Halsey got the Distinguished Service Medal, and his Chief of Staff, Miles Browning, was promoted to captain. The difficulties of the task forces in these early days of the war were indicated by the story of Admiral Wilson Brown's Task Force 11, which was sent down from Pearl Harbor on January 31st to escort the Neosho. Brown's orders were to refuel Task Force 8 and then oppose the enemy before returning to Pearl Harbor on February 16th. He had 42 days' provision aboard the Lexington. 2 days out of Pearl, Brown learned that Halsey would not need the fuel after all, so he headed for Canton Island. But on February 6th, King ordered the forces down to the Anzac, Australia-New Zealand waters, for a joint operation with Leary's force. They met 300 miles west of Suva, and Brown took over the Anzacs for the moment, while Leary moved down to Melbourne to establish a headquarters. Task Force 11, so augmented, was to make a surprise raid on Rabaul. It was Brown's idea. King approved. On February 13th, the force began refuelling from the Neosho. Lexington and the destroyers filled up, but the cruisers were only 75% full, and Brown regarded this as a serious handicap to his operations. He had communications problems too. He wanted surprise, so much so that to communicate with King and Nimitz, he flew 2 officers from his staff over to Suva to send radio messages and preserve the silence of the task force. A serious problem developed when the Anzacs fell short of fuel, but Rear Admiral J.G. Crace wanted to get into the fight. Brown assigned him to cover Suva and Noumea and take on any Japanese who showed up. Rear Admiral Thomas O. Kincaid was in command of the cruisers of Task Force 11. The forces parted company, and Brown headed northwest toward the Solomons, intending to approach Rabaul from the northeast. On February 20th, about 420 miles out from Rabaul, the force was jumped by enemy scout planes, and then 18 two-engined bombers. 16 of these were shot down, Brown said. One of the problems early in the war was an American tendency to overestimate casualties dealt the enemy, but in this case it seems that most of the attackers were shot down, at least by Samuel Eliot Morrison's estimate. In his action report, Brown then noted some of his observations. They were all short of fuel, which placed an absolute limit on high-speed operations. The italics are Brown's. A properly planned raid, which he did not consider this one to be, must start from a base near the enemy. The ships must fuel outside the range of shore-based aircraft. At this point, since he had lost the element of surprise, Brown withdrew from the Rabaul operation to the south and was met by the Anzacs. Again, there was not enough fuel for all ships, and the Anzacs went off to Suva to fuel, while Task Force 11 moved into the Coral Sea to patrol toward New Guinea. On March 2nd, Brown received orders to link up with Task Force 17 and carry out an operation against the Japanese. Back at Pearl, Nimitz was having a rare struggle with King by radio, King insisting on fleet action in the southwest Pacific against the Japanese to slow down that juggernaut advance that seemed aimed at Australia. On February 7th, Nimitz had said he did not have the forces to make anything but hit-and-run raids in the southwest. King wanted him to use his battleships, but Nimitz said they simply would not fit. He did not have the destroyers and cruisers to screen them. King was doing everything he could. He was moving his chessmen here and there furiously. He promised Nimitz marine units from Iceland to form an amphibious unit. Then he asked for 12 B-17S from Hawaii Army forces to support Task Force 11. King had great hopes for Task Force 11 as a stopper for the Japanese. Nimitz wanted to hold off other raids for a time, but King disagreed flatly and insisted that Nimitz was not using his battleships properly, and that he must continue offensive operations in the Middle Pacific, around Wake and the Marshalls, if he could do nothing else to slow the Japanese advance in the southwest. Nimitz and his staff were testy about the latest development. This makes the situation particularly difficult as though orders have commenced. Task Force 11, extra light forces and tankers are being tied up in the Suva area. To resolve the differences, Nimitz put Admiral Pai on a plane and sent him to Washington to present the Nimitz viewpoint. He and the staff sweated day and night, trying to find some way to use their slender forces to stop the Japanese descending on Australia. They considered sending Halsey to join Brown and make a big raid on Rabaul, while Fletcher either held in reserve or attacked Wake. They even considered a raid on Tokyo, but gave up the idea because there would be bad weather for fueling. They decided to send Halsey out to attack Wake, now calling his force Task Force 16. He was originally scheduled for Eniwetok, but Japanese activity there was reported to be very limited. By February 15th, Admiral King had apparently cooled down enough to realize the limitations of the Pacific Fleet, and he told Nimitz by message that occasional raids in the mandated islands, Gilbert's and Marshall's, would be considered sufficient for the moment. He was happier because of Brown's plans to raid Rabaul. Nimitz was not very happy. Pye returned from Washington on February 26th with the bad news that King did not have an overall plan for action in the Pacific. Nimitz was being hammered to help Australia, but he did not know what his priorities were to be. In the southwest Pacific, the Rabaul raid was coming unravelled. Brown was in the Coral Sea at the beginning of March, worrying because an enemy force might enter the sea without detection. On March 2nd, he barely avoided a hurricane, then fuelled. Admiral Fletcher joined up, and he and his staff from Yorktown came about Lexington for a conference. Fletcher wanted a dawn attack for 125 miles out against Gasmata and Rabaul. Brown wanted to go in at night by moonlight. He did not want to go into the 125 miles point for a dawn attack. It was too risky. Fletcher demurred. His men were not experienced enough in night flying, he said. Earlier, Fletcher had called off a last sweep at Jaluit after the storm clouds blew over, because he would have to recover his planes after dark if he sent them off. So Brown agreed reluctantly to the dawn attack. Task Forces 11 and 17 had maintained radio silence since February 20th, sometimes to the annoyance of Nimitz and King, who would have liked to know what they were doing. But on March 8th, the two forces were suddenly caught in a squall before Brown, as senior officer, could execute his flag signals. There was very grave danger of collision between the forces, so Brown authorized a breach of radio silence to send a message on the warning net. This shows the urgent need for TBS, talk between ships, or high-frequency radio, which could not be picked up by forces far away, Brown wrote in his action report. The second violation came when a cruiser scout plane was lost, and the Lexington tried to bring it in. The plane crew recovered 6 days later. This indicated to Brown the urgent need for homing equipment on the planes. Brown was certain that the Japanese had picked up the signals, and that once again the element of surprise, which he held absolutely essential, had been lost. So he moved away from Rabaul again. Not to break radio silence, he sent officers to Townsville to radio dispatches back to Washington and Pearl Harbor. His force was short of provisions. Since early January, the San Francisco had been without replenishment. Brown had 90 days dry stores on the Lexington, and he began doling them out to destroyers and cruisers at sea. It was good practice for the men. Wilson Brown's messages had many recommendations for Nimitz and the others. He pointed out that the senior officer of the force, the officer in tactical command, OTC, had no way of holding conferences and coordinating attacks. They needed a base in the southwest Pacific, Noumea or Suva. He had been able to fuel at sea, but they could not always expect such favourable conditions as he had enjoyed. Brown felt, however, that he could hold the enemy in check unless the Japanese assigned a major fleet to the area. He advocated daily bombing of the ships and bases from the Australian coast and constant submarine harassment from Townsville or Noumea, and then he headed back to Pearl with one final warning: that since carrier planes have shorter radii than shore-based planes, carrier attack on enemy shipping in defended ports will be successful only when the attack arrives as a complete surprise to the enemy, and even then, when surprise is successful, the carrier will run serious risks of heavy attack by surviving enemy planes. In other words, the ever-growing importance and effectiveness of aircraft has not changed the old truism that ships are at a disadvantage in attacking strongly defended shore positions. Halsey, with Spruance again leading the cruisers, went to Wake on February 24th and then hit Marcus Island on March 4th. Not much came out of these raids, except practice for the officers and men of the fleet, but at least one thing could be said: the Pacific Fleet was getting into the war. Chapter 4. The Changing Scene, March 1st. May 8th, 1942. The morale of the American public had been boosted by the successful carrier strikes in the Central and Southwest Pacific, but as far as the High Command was concerned, March 1942 marked a new low point, The Japanese were moving ahead, almost at will it seemed. On March 11th, General Douglas MacArthur left Bataan for Australia, and it was apparent that sick, abandoned Americans in the Philippines could hold out only for a matter of weeks. At Pearl Harbor, it was a most trying time for Admiral Nimitz and his staff, but few men around him even suspected how tightly knotted were the Admiral's nerves, or how badly he slept at night. His establishment of a solid routine belied these facts. He arose, breakfasted around 7:30, went down to the submarine base where his office was located. Almost always he lunched with his officers and then went back to work. Toward the end of the afternoon he would organize a game of tennis with 3 of the other officers. 40 years older and 30 pounds heavier than in his days at the academy, he still played a sharp game, although his doctors had long since advised him to give up the violent exertions of singles. He was a placement expert and could run his younger opponents ragged with nice little shots chopped along the lines. Or Nimitz would take on one officer or a handful in horseshoes, a game that stimulated idle conversation and got one's mind off the vital and sometimes depressing business at hand. Later, when matters became too tense, he was likely to be found on the pistol range. He had a gallery built alongside his office, and those who knew him might suspect what was going on in his mind as he squeezed off one careful shot after another. But they could do no more than suspect, for Nimitz was the perfect command figure. He kept his thoughts thoroughly to himself, except as he needed to communicate with his subordinates to further the ends of the war. Of small talk there was plenty, with stories and grins and laughter, but of the grim days that lay ahead there was no talk at all. Exercise cleared Nimitz's mind, warded off the results of yielding to the temptations of his cook, and helped him sleep at night. A walk of several miles was not unusual, with younger officers puffing along behind, and if the walk was along the shore, Nimitz might slip into the sea and swim for a mile. On days when there was no time for such lengthy relaxation, he was known to organize a health club and stimulate his juniors by smacking a medicine ball into their soft bellies. The other officers were not soft long, for the old man's example brought most of the younger ones around, and the submarine base was probably the healthiest major headquarters in the world. In the daily conferences, when tensions ran high and disagreements threatened to flare into the open, Nimitz exerted his remarkable memory and his precise timing to carry a discussion to the absolute limit of usefulness and rescue it from futile argument with a brief telling story. Sometimes he made up these tales on the spot, but he was forever swapping stories with Secretary Knox by mail, and as the people of the Pacific learned of this interest, they brought him stories from near and far. Nimitz's patience was tried almost to the limit, for the powers in Washington had not yet formulated an overall approach to the war against Japan. Early in March, Admiral King asked Nimitz for comment on the subdivision of the Pacific areas. The Joint Chiefs were trying to work out the relationship between MacArthur and Nimitz. Generally speaking, it was a time of consolidation and regrouping, waiting for whatever strength could be spared to the Pacific from the needs stated by the forces committed to Europe. Toward the end of the month, Admiral Theobald made another estimate of the situation, and it was taken up in the morning conference by Nimitz. Theobald said the Japanese would probably not move against either India or Australia, but that an attack on Hawaii was probable. He recommended holding strong forces within a 36-hour run of Oahu until the Japanese committed themselves one way or another. Nimitz sought a consensus, and it was that such an attack might come but that it had best not come, because Nimitz did not have the strong forces to operate as Theobald wished. Wilson Brown went on to hit Lae and Salamaua, where the Japanese had landed on March 8th, and on March 10th, 104 planes from the 2 carriers crossed the Owen Stanley Mountains and attacked, sinking a minesweeper, a transport, and a converted light cruiser. The pilots came back with optimistic accounts of even greater damage, and they were forwarded. When the news reached President Roosevelt, he was so pleased that he sent a special message to Winston Churchill. "It was by all means the best day's work we have had," the President said. As Brown's forces returned, Vice Admiral Halsey flew to the west coast to make arrangements for a special operation that had been originated by King and his staff. It was to be a raid by B-25 medium bombers from a carrier, which would take them as close as possible to the Japanese homeland, so they could hit Tokyo and other targets. When a staff officer from Washington came to Pearl Harbor to present the plan, Admiral Dremel had opposed it as wasteful of America's limited air power. Most of the planes would certainly be lost, Dremel said, and the amount of damage they could do was very limited. The planes would be much better in Australia or at some advanced base where they could strike the Japanese day after day. But Dremel was overruled, for the admirals and generals in Washington felt the need for some spectacular operation that could raise American morale and retaliate for Pearl Harbor. The Doolittle-Tokyo raid, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle of the Army Air Corps, was on. At this same time, as Wilson Brown was coming back, King indicated that he was less than pleased with the return. On March 30th, he sent a message questioning Brown's apparent retirement from the enemy. That same day, Nimitz detached Brown from task force duty and made him commander of the new amphibious force, to have headquarters at San Diego. King had decided that Brown was not aggressive enough to be a task force commander. There was much talk about amphibious operations. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, head of King's War Plans Division, was working up a plan that he hoped would persuade King to create the machinery for a naval program. Turner was an able student of amphibious warfare and was supervising the revision of the Navy's plans for this type of operation. It was apparent to all concerned that if the territory wrested by the Axis powers from the Western powers was to be retrieved, it would have to be by amphibious landings. So Wilson Brown would go to establish the Pacific Amphibious Force, which would be called Task Force 3. By April, the lines of command in the Pacific were being sorted out. King informed Nimitz on April 4th that he would have the Pacific Ocean area, that General MacArthur would command the Southwest Pacific, and that MacArthur would have his own navy, with Vice Admiral Leary to command it. Nimitz selected Pai to become his commander in the South Pacific and to face the new problems. Among them was the fact that New Zealand, Noumea and Fiji fell within the Nimitz command, while the area where the Navy had been in operation around the Solomons and New Guinea was actually in MacArthur's territory. On April 8th, an exuberant Halsey departed with the famous Task Force 16, which would carry him, the Enterprise, and the Hornet with its B-25S towards Japan. 10 days later, the attack was carried off, but Nimitz and his staff were of two minds about it. It tied up important forces, 2 carriers, 4 cruisers, 8 destroyers and 2 oilers. For a long time, the damage was very slight, and the risk of losing a carrier was very great. It would not be done again. But the consideration of the Tokyo raid was a minor matter compared to what else was occurring. On April 18th, Nimitz was gearing himself for a new offensive by the Japanese in the Southwest Pacific. It was expected to come around the 1st of May in the Solomons, New Guinea, New Britain area. Nimitz felt that he must support MacArthur with the forces he could use. He could not use battleships because of the difficulty of screening and supporting them. He could use carriers. He was hoping to have 2 carrier task forces of 2 carriers each to send down to the area. The admirals were learning how to use task forces, and Halsey was learning faster than any other. Before December 7th, 1941, there was no important body of information about carrier warfare. The carrier was a new weapon developed between the wars, and although the British had some experience, especially at Taranto, American experience was limited to manoeuvres over a period of about 14 years, and manoeuvres are not war. In the Marcus raid of March 4th, for example, Halsey for the first time used radar to locate his own air group on their way to the target and to correct their navigation. He learned that his planes needed incendiary bullets to attack land objectives effectively. He spoke again, as had Brown and Fletcher, of the need for leak-proof fuel tanks. It is quite possible that the only casualty of this attack, the loss of 6 S-7 which was forced down on fire, was due to this deficiency. He reported the need for reserve pilots, particularly since the carriers might be at battle stations for 20 hours or more, with the pilots flying a 4 or 5 hour mission, then coming home to have to fly search and patrol missions. The enemy has a tendency, when part of the attacking surface vessels have been located, to concentrate his air strength upon it, and to regard as of secondary importance, for the time, the locating of other forces known or suspected to be in the area. There results a dangerous and heavy attack upon the one, but the other may escape detection and attack. 2 carriers provide alternate airports, each of which could accommodate 2 air groups in an emergency. It should not necessarily follow that, because a carrier suffers serious damage, it must lose its entire air group. On the other hand, a carrier's underwater body and below-deck machinery might remain unimpaired, yet 2 or more well-placed bombs or a serious hangar or flight deck fire might make recovery of the air group impossible. In Washington, the Naval High Command was planning many changes for the future of carrier operations, and Admiral Towers, Chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, was fretting because these aviators, of whom so much was asked, were not being advanced rapidly enough. Towers prepared for King a memorandum listing the officers under the rank of Rear Admiral whom he found strongest in ability, aggressiveness, stamina, and modern ideas. They included Mark Mitcher, C.P. Mason, Ralph E. Davison, Gerald F.B. Bogan, Arthur Radford, J.D. Price, Donald B. Duncan, Forrest P. Sherman, and half a dozen others. Not one of these officers was on Nimitz's staff. Nimitz, at this time, was preparing for an important meeting. Late in April, he boarded the big flying boat that had been placed at his command and headed for San Francisco. There, on April 25th, he and his aides would meet with Admiral King to discuss high strategy that neither wished to confide to messages or secret hand-carried letters. King and Nimitz had agreed to meet at the offices of the commander of the 12th Naval District in San Francisco. Beginning April 25th, they met for 3 days. First, they discussed the matter of radio intelligence. In the past few months, a bright intelligence officer on the staff of the 14th Naval District, Lieutenant Commander Rochefort, had begun to unravel the Japanese naval code, and through application and some intelligent guesswork, the Americans were able to tune in on some Japanese plans and operations. It was absolutely essential, the commanders agreed, that all information about Rochefort's work and the substance and terminology of the radio intelligence be suppressed. They began then to discuss personnel in the Pacific Fleet. King expressed considerable uneasiness about Frank Jack Fletcher's operations. He was worried that Fletcher was not in control of his carrier task force at all times, that Fletcher was not aggressive enough to carry the war against the enemy. Nimitz expressed his concern on the same matters, but Nimitz had learned something a long time ago in the Philippines, that a good man may find himself in a bad situation. King agreed with Nimitz that they should wait and see how Fletcher comported himself in future operations. Nimitz was very pleased with Wilson Brown, and King, who was less enthusiastic about Brown, agreed that the other would recommend Brown for the Distinguished Service Medal. They talked about decorations a bit, then more about personnel. Secretary Knox and King wanted to bring youth into command, so admirals who were getting ready to retire would not be employed in future operations. Brown was regarded as one of these admirals. King suggested that Nimitz begin using junior flag officers at sea. Admiral Jacobs, who had replaced Nimitz as Chief of Personnel, suggested that it might be time for Wilson Brown to retire in favor of a younger man. Nimitz was aware of King's astringent personality and his strong views. He had had experience with King when the latter was commander of the Atlantic Fleet, and Nimitz headed the personnel division. King had one important personality trait involving personnel. If he once got down on a man for some failure or apparent failure to perform at the highest standard, that man would never be employed in high position if King could stop it. Admiral John Hoover, who had served as a carrier commander under King, said that when King announced in the evening that he proposed to be underway at 0730 in the morning, he did not mean 0731, and when he said underway, he did not mean casting off. Another officer who enjoyed an extremely distinguished wartime career in the Pacific never achieved flag rank during the war, although his record entitled him to it. The reason? Before the war, he had been in command of a ship that ran aground, and King simply stopped every effort to promote this officer. Because of this, because of his own willingness to give a man every chance, because he did not want to become involved in such matters as the replacement of officers he admired, Nimitz suggested that Admiral Jacobs make the assignments of officers to command and flag positions. Obviously, it would save him much embarrassment. King and Nimitz then talked about the carriers and their major weapons. King had qualified as an aviator and wore those wings. Nimitz's knowledge of aviation was limited to his studies at the Naval War College and his reading since. It was apparent that much was being learned in combat, and King said the combat carrier men must teach the new men, so the principle of makey learn, a bit of pidgin to describe the battle education of a rear admiral who was selected to command a task group, was adopted for the fleet. And as for battle, should carrier group commanders be separate from task force commanders? Nimitz and King agreed that the best man to ask was the man who had performed best to date, Admiral Halsey. Pye would not go south. Instead, Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley would become commander of the South Pacific area. Pye would remain with Nimitz for the time being. The joint command, with Nimitz separated from MacArthur by the equator and the meridian at 160 degrees east, was not a month old, and it was to be expected that there would be some difficulties. The army had directed MacArthur to bomb more ships, but without much effect. Still, Nimitz and King spoke of the need for mutual cooperation in this strained situation. Nor was that the only strain. Nimitz felt that he needed specific authority to direct the movements of army troops and planes within his area. Furthermore, with this new responsibility, he needed a supply service for the South Pacific. The meetings ended with discussions of the fleet-building program and the assistance Nimitz could expect from home, and he returned to Pearl Harbor. King had agreed to the assignment of carriers in pairs to the task forces. On Nimitz's return to Pearl Harbor, he told Halsey to be ready to take Task Force 16 to the Coral Sea on April 30th. Task Force 17 was still there. Nimitz's next move was to send Task Force 1, the battleship force, back to the west coast for the moment, under Pye. Gormley was officially ordered to go south, aided by Rear Admiral J.S. McCain as commander of air forces in the South Pacific. McCain was a tough, wizened aviator who wrote an indecipherable scrawl, rolled his own cigarettes, and left a trail of tobacco bits wherever he went, and was ready to fight like a demon. McCain had come to aviation late in life. He took up flying in 1935 at the age of 51, but he was a pilot and an air admiral, the first in the Pacific to command. Another air admiral was moving south, Rear Admiral Aubrey W. Fitch, commander of the Air Task Force. He was in the Lexington, while Frank Jack Fletcher, the senior admiral, was in the Yorktown. The American carriers still had their problems. In the dive bombers, the windshields had a tendency to fog up, and so did the sight telescopes. The bomb-release solenoids in Yorktown's planes were most unreliable. In the Salamaua Lay raid, the Lexington's torpedoes did not function very well, and it was suspected there was something seriously wrong with them. It was intended, obviously, that Halsey was to be in charge of the South Pacific carrier operations, and at Pearl, when they spoke of his departure in Task Force 16 for the Coral Sea area, the members of the staff said as much. But as it worked out, Nimitz knew pretty well that Halsey could never reach the Coral Sea before the fireworks began, unless his radio intelligence was much in error. The Japanese were planning to occupy Port Moresby and Tulagi and southeastern New Guinea. Nimitz hoped to break up the occupation with a carrier raid, which, under the circumstances, almost had to be staged under Admiral Fletcher. Fletcher had been in the South Pacific since March with his Task Force 17, operating directly under the orders of King. Nimitz had sent the transport bridge down to Noumea with provisions for Fletcher to arrive around the 1st of April. The destroyers of the task force were getting low on provisions, and Fletcher sent a dispatch to King with a copy to Leary in Australia, telling them he would return to Noumea about April 1st for provisions. On March 29th, Army aviators reported to Leary that they had sighted Task Force 17,228 miles south of Rabaul. What they had seen, apparently, was an enemy force of some kind, which they had mistaken for Fletcher's. The confusion became complete when Fletcher told Leary where he actually was, and sent a copy of the message to King. By that time, King had blown up and asked Fletcher if he was retiring in the vicinity of the enemy. King did not forget such actions. Fletcher's policy was to wait in the Coral Sea until the enemy moved south and then attack. Some of his staff wanted him to move in on Rabaul and attack the shipping, as King and Nimitz certainly wanted too. But Fletcher was certain that to do so would be to expose himself and lose the surprise element, as Wilson Brown was sure he had done earlier. On March 30th, Leary reported from Australia that the Japanese were moving south, and Fletcher said he would attack the Shortland Islands area on April 6th. But as Fletcher approached, he found the Japanese were gone, and he had no definite information about Japanese concentrations. So again the attack was off, as Fletcher told Leary on April 4th. At about this time, Yorktown's leak-proof gas tanks began going sour, Fletcher said, and on April 14th, when he was reduced to 12 operational fighters, Fletcher announced that he was retiring to Tongatabu if any more trouble developed. Next day, the command situation was straightened out, and Fletcher was placed under Nimitz, who ordered him to Tongatabu for supplies. On May 1st, Fletcher returned to the Coral Sea to meet Admiral Fitch and Admiral Crace of the Anzac Force, who had the cruisers. Fueling again took an enormous amount of time. Morrison remarks in Vol. 4, p. 22. As usual in forces commanded by Admiral Fletcher, fueling was a very leisurely affair. Fletcher now was in charge of the whole force as senior officer. His task was to break up the enemy movement by the only means at hand, a hit-and-run raid by the carriers. Fletcher's force fueled from the oiler Neosho. Fitch fueled from the oiler Tippecanoe, but before Fitch's own force took fuel, he let the cruiser Chicago and the destroyer Perkins fill up, so they could go north and join Fletcher. Thus, Fitch's 2 carriers and 4 destroyers did not begin replenishing their oil until May 2nd. Fitch was told that the fueling could not be completed until noon of May 4th, and Fletcher moved. He had intelligence from the MacArthur headquarters, referring to the movement of the Japanese. At 1800 on May 2nd, Fletcher headed west from his station southwest of Espiritu Santo, with instructions for Fitch to meet him at a rendezvous at daylight on May 4th. At this time, the Japanese invasion force under Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue was moving very rapidly. At 0800 on the morning of May 3rd, Rear Admiral Kiyohide Shima landed his amphibious force on Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. Thus the Japanese intended to secure control of the Coral Sea and areas all around it. They would move to Port Moresby too, to Samoa, the Fijis, and New Caledonia. That plan was the original Japanese war plan for the Pacific. Had King and Nimitz known that the Japanese intended to stop at the Solomons, they might have reacted less vigorously. But the Japanese were as flushed with victory as a schoolboy drinking sake. Initially, they had expected it would take 5 or 6 months to conquer the Philippines, Malaya, and the Netherlands East Indies, and 6 months to restore the damage done by the retreating Westerners. In fact, all this was accomplished by May 1942. The Japanese military planners then were victimized by their own propaganda, which told them that the Westerners were decadent and unable to withstand the Sons of Heaven in equal combat. Their losses until this point had been negligible. No ship larger than a destroyer had gone down, and altogether, in taking the Pacific in West and South and Southeast Asia, they had lost only 100 vessels of all types, a few hundred airplanes, and a few thousand sailors, soldiers, and marines. As they planned this Operation Mo, the Japanese expected opposition. There would be planes from Australia and 1 American carrier, the Saratoga. This task force was expected to steam into the Coral Sea, where it would be caught in a pincers movement by Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto on the one side, with the light carrier Shoho, 4 heavy cruisers and a destroyer, and Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi's force of 2 fleet carriers, 2 heavy cruisers, and 6 destroyers. Nimitz's intelligence had indicated that the Japanese plans would be finished on May 3rd, and this intelligence turned out to be precisely correct. Fletcher was fueling again that day, and so was Fitch. They were about 100 miles apart. On the evening of May 3rd, Fletcher received a new intelligence report from MacArthur that announced the Tulagi landings. Fletcher sent Neosho to the rendezvous to meet Fitch the next morning, and steamed straight north toward Tulagi at 24 knots, ready to strike. At Tulagi, the Japanese were overconfident of success, because success had come so easily to them since December 7, 1941. So having landed unopposed, the naval support forces of heavy ships left the area 3 hours after the landings. Fletcher steamed all night, increasing his speed to 27 knots, and on the morning of May 4th he was 100 miles southwest of Guadalcanal, at just about the moment that Fitch encountered the Neosho and learned of the new developments. Fletcher's orders had been for Fitch to meet him about 300 miles southeast of Guadalcanal. Soon Admiral Crace came up with the Australia, Hobart, and Whipple, and the two admirals moved away from Fletcher as ordered. At 0630 on May 4th, Admiral Fletcher began launching 12 torpedo planes and 28 dive bombers, and a combat air patrol of 6 fighters. The Yorktown had only 18 operational fighters, which were to be used in groups of 6 to protect the carrier. Thus there were no fighters to protect the bombers. The torpedo planes were off first, and they set out independently to attack. Then came the dive bombers. The dive bombers arrived first, they were faster, and attacked. They wrecked a destroyer, which had to be beached, and 2 small minesweepers. The torpedo bombers sank 1 minesweeper. Then the planes returned, all safely, and armed for a second strike. On the second strike, 27 dive bombers and 11 torpedo bombers went out. The dive bombers damaged 1 patrol craft and sank 2 seaplanes. The torpedo bombers were less effective. 12 torpedoes were launched, and 12 torpedoes skidded aimlessly into the sea and sank to the bottom as their motors ran down. Fighters were sent out, and they destroyed 3 Japanese seaplanes and strafed a destroyer, killing her captain and some of the crew. 2 fighters were lost in operational accidents, but both pilots were rescued. A third dive bomber attack sank 4 landing barges. The Americans had enjoyed the freedom of the air all day long. The Japanese at Tulagi had radioed for help, but Admiral Takagi was fueling north of Bougainville. He rushed southeast, but could not help. Fletcher moved to the rendezvous point he had announced to Fitch, and they met on the morning of May 5th. Fletcher fueled. With the amount of fueling done here, one is reminded of the worrisome days of the old coal-burning ships. That evening he headed northwest, expecting the Japanese to come out of Rabaul. On May 6th, the American and Australian forces moved on together. Fletcher indicated that he intended to delegate the tactical command of the carrier force to the short, rugged Fitch, who was the most experienced carrier commander in the United States Navy. But through some failure of communications, Fitch was not informed of this delegation until much later. By the afternoon of May 6th, Fletcher knew of the movement of the Port Moresby invasion group, and at 19:30 that night he moved northwest so he could be within striking distance on the morning of May 7th. Unfortunately, the American information was very scanty. There were not enough land-based search planes to cover the area properly, and so Fletcher knew nothing of the whereabouts of Admiral Takagi's fleet carriers. Takagi spent about as much time fueling as did Fletcher. On May 5th and 6th, he did not even bother to send out search planes. If he had done so, he would have caught Fletcher fueling. At one time, Fletcher and Takagi were only 70 miles apart. The Japanese were having their communications problems too. At 1100 on May 6th, a Japanese search plane from Rabaul found Fletcher and reported, but Takagi did not get the word for hours, and when he did, Fletcher was moving in a different direction. On the afternoon of May 6th, Admiral Inouye estimated that Fletcher was moving up, probably about 500 miles from the Japanese at that moment. He ordered the operations to continue on plan, with the Port Moresby invasion force to move in, and Takagi and Goto to close the pincers on the Americans. On the morning of May 7th, Admiral Takagi's search planes from Shokaku and Zuikaku, the 2 big fleet carriers, were out on search. Just after 0730, one pilot reported excitedly that he had found the American carrier force, and he gave the position 16 degrees south, 158 degrees east. The Japanese launched a torpedo and bombing attack. The ships sighted were the unlucky oiler Neosho and her destroyer escort Sims, which had peeled off to find a safe rendezvous well away from the area where battle was to be joined. Scores of torpedo planes, horizontal bombers and dive bombers hit the two ships. Sims was smashed by 3 500-pound bombs, 2 of which exploded in the engine room. She began to sink and then exploded. Only 15 of her crew were saved. Neosho was soon smashed too, but she remained afloat. The navigator made an error in taking a position sight, and it was 4 days before she was discovered and her survivors rescued. After that, she was sunk. That day, Fletcher detached Admiral Crace to attack the Port Moresby invasion force, while Fletcher sought battle with the carriers. Crace then drew the attention of the land-based Japanese bombers. Because of an error in communications, the next morning Yorktown and Lexington launched a strike of 93 planes against a very small force at right angles to the Takagi force. But on flying to the target, the attack group of Lexington found the Goto force with the carrier Shoho and attacked. Within half an hour, all 93 planes had attacked her, and she was sunk. All but 3 of the American planes returned to their carriers before noon, and Admiral Goto's half of the pincers retired to the northeast. In the afternoon, the air commanders of Yorktown and Lexington were raring to go on another strike, but Fletcher held them back. He had Zuikaku and Shokaku to contend with. The weather was bad, and he decided to rely on shore-based search craft. He steamed west, planning to hit the Port Moresby invasion force the next day. But the Japanese had been frightened off, temporarily, by the Crace move. Admiral Inouye had told the invasion force to stand off and wait until the American carrier force was destroyed. That evening, American and Japanese carrier planes crossed and fought, 9 Japanese going down and 2 Americans. Several Japanese planes mistook the American carriers for their own, and eventually the Japanese had to turn on their lights to bring back their own planes. That night, each force had a pretty good idea of the location of the other, and both Fletcher and Inouye contemplated night attacks. Fletcher decided against it in the interest of concentrating his force for attack against the carriers next morning. Inouye's position was that he had to protect his invasion force. That was his prime responsibility. In the morning, the forces found one another. At 0830, Fletcher was ready to launch, and only at this time did he tell Fitch that the junior admiral was now in command of the tactical force. Fitch and his force were out in the bright sunlight. The Yorktown planes found Shokaku and attacked her first. The torpedoes failed, but 2 bomb hits were scored on the carrier, one of which made it impossible for her to launch again until repaired. So except for the strike just launched, as an offensive weapon, Shokaku was out of the fight. Zuikaku was attacked, but escaped unhurt. The Japanese planes crossed paths with the Americans, and the Japanese airstrike was conducted in a far more effective fashion than the American. Lexington took 2 torpedoes and 2 bombs. Yorktown took 1 800-pound bomb in the flight deck, but it penetrated 4 decks and killed or wounded 66 men. The carrier battle was over before noon on May 8th. The Japanese believed they had sunk both American carriers, but with the loss of Shoho and the departure of Shokaku, Admiral Inouye cancelled his invasion. He was afraid of the Army Air Force bombers that ranged along the shores of Papua. Admiral Yamamoto did not like this decision, and ordered Takagi to take Zuikaku and wipe out the American forces, but it was too late. Contact was lost. At the end of the Battle of the Coral Sea, Lexington was in very bad shape. She was listing and partly flooded, but an hour later she could recover and launch planes. Then an explosion smashed her insides. A generator somewhere below had been left running, and gasoline fumes from leaky tanks had collected, then blasted the ship with more fury than any torpedo. One explosion followed another, until finally Admiral Fitch ordered the ship abandoned, and the orderly retreat began. She was still exploding as the last men went over the side, and then she was sunk by torpedoes. That afternoon, Nimitz ordered Fletcher to leave the Coral Sea, and the battle was over. The Japanese invasion of Port Moresby was turned back. At Pearl Harbor, Nimitz was very much concerned about the loss of Neosho and the Sims, for he could not afford to lose either ship. The early reports from the Coral Sea indicated a red letter day, however, with one Japanese carrier sunk and another badly damaged. Then came the bad news about Lexington. Still, there was much to rejoice about at Pearl Harbor. For the first time, a Japanese movement had been stopped. The Americans had lost more ships, and more important ships, and could afford to lose them less than the Japanese. But Port Moresby was saved. As far as the Lexington was concerned, if it had not been for the carelessness of one man who left an electric motor running, there might not have been any gasoline explosion. With the state of affairs on Lexington, her gas tanks leaky from hits and near misses, a match or even a spark from a nail or a dropped tool could have accomplished the same thing. As the Nimitz endorsement on the Task Force 17 action report put it, means must be provided for reducing the menace to carriers of the large quantities of gasoline carried. Nimitz had many comments for the consideration of King and his battle commanders. In the Tulagi attacks of May 4th, 22 torpedoes and 76 1,000-pound bombs were released, resulting in 5 torpedo hits and 11 bomb hits. Considering that there was practically no air opposition and very little anti-aircraft fire, the ammunition expenditure required to disable the number of enemy ships involved is disappointing. This is particularly true in the instance where 11 torpedoes were fired against a manoeuvring aircraft tender without any hits. Although fogging of sights and windshields affected accuracy of the first attack, this condition did not apply in subsequent ones begun from lower altitudes. As for the action on May 8th, Nimitz seriously doubted the pilot's claim that both carriers were hit. The reports of the attacks by the two air groups do not clearly prove that both carriers were attacked and damaged. It is possible that only one enemy carrier was hit on May 8th, and that the air groups of the Lexington and Yorktown attacked the same carriers. The second carrier may have taken advantage of cloud concealment and thereby escaped. If the number of hits is approximately as claimed, 8 torpedoes and 8 heavy-case 1,000-pound bombs fused with Mark 21 and Mark 23 100th second fuse, both bomb and warhead must be improved. Sarcasm? From the experience, Fletcher had learned that he needed more fighter planes for protection. Nimitz agreed and suggested that fighters be increased to 27. Also that the torpedo planes be replaced, slow TBDs by faster TBFs.